So thank you all so much for coming tonight. This is our third RelTalk in this series this semester. And RelTalk is a multidisciplinary team of researchers and practitioners dedicated to increasing access to research on relationships. And like I mentioned, this is the third in our series of 6 presenters. We ask that you please keep your camera off and mute yourself the whole time. We will have a time for questions here at the end. And so for that, you will just put those questions right into the chat and I will be the one that passes those along to Melinda. To introduce our speaker tonight, Melinda Murdock is a first-year doctoral student in the Family Sciences program at the University of Kentucky. Before beginning her PhD, she completed her master's in couple and family therapy at the University of Kentucky. She now works as a marriage and family therapist associate at a local private practice in Lexington. Melissa was recently named a DREAM Scholar, and DREAMS is Disparities Researchers Equalizing Access for Minorities by UK's Centre for Clinical and Translational Science. She considers herself a social justice advocate and is passionate about improving the quality of Black couple and family relationships. Melissa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm going to share my screen with all of you so you can see my presentation. All right. Yeah, thank you again, Caroline, for that introduction. I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here today to listen to my talk. I want to say thank you to Relevate in general for giving me the opportunity to share my work. So to give you a brief overview of what I'll be sharing today, first, I'm going to provide a summary of my study that inspired this talk. Then I'm going to talk about how the findings and the results of that study inspired me to understand this cycle of connection and disconnection that Black couples go through. And finally, I'm going to talk about the repairing power of relational equity. I'm hoping that some takeaways for you will be understanding the unique stressors that racial and ethnically diverse couples experience, what it looks like to maintain connection while experiencing disconnection, and what an equitable relationship looks like, and finally, hopefully some tools and best practices for your own relationship. And so what I want to talk about first is what was missing in the research, and for me, why it was so important to do this study. I was surprised at first when I saw the statistics on Black marriage, and it's that Black couples are more likely to experience divorce and instability than any other racial group in the US. But the more I thought about it, it wasn't surprising, right? Because Black couples are experiencing unique stressors that other couples aren't, especially white couples aren't experiencing. And so there's this kind of extra layer of stress on the relationship. But the problem with the research is that scholars were making assumptions about healthy relationship and what healthy relationships look like based on studies that were only looking at white couples. And so if we're holding Black couples to the standard of white couples who aren't experiencing these stressors, then we fall into the trap of creating this narrative of dysfunction and instability about Black marriage and Black relationships. So to me, it was important to include racial discrimination as a factor in the study in understanding how it creates stress on the relationship and can produce these outcomes. And even when I found studies that did consider racial discrimination, they were always focused on weaknesses, right? And what the couples lacked because of this experience. But I wanted to provide a different perspective in how maybe even Black couple relationships are protective against experiences with racism. And so that led me to the research question, how does the support Black couples provide each other reduce stress from experiences with racism and improve their overall quality of their relationship? So the way this research question and the study addressed those gaps were: 1, I recruited only participants that identified as Black or African American. 2, almost most important, I measured racial discrimination as a factor in as to why we see outcomes in relationship quality. And thirdly, I focused on the strengths. And like I said earlier, viewing the relationship as protective and almost deflecting in some ways against experiences with racism. Because if this is a same race couple, they can both identify with these stressors. Before I go through the rest of the presentation, I thought it would be helpful to define define a few terms that I may use frequently. So the first is interpersonal. Interpersonal simply means the space between two people and what happens there. It can be communication or even interaction. Next, marginalization is essentially putting a person or a group of people in a powerless or a disadvantaged position. Mutual empathy is the practice of perspective taking. So in other words, it's when two people can simultaneously put each other in one another's shoes and really have this kind of mutual understanding of one another. Racial discrimination is as it sounds, only instead of racism as a belief and an attitude, racial discrimination is the action behind the belief and attitude. And finally, resiliency is the ability to overcome, withstand, or adapt to adversity. So to provide an overview of the study, all couples were same race Black couples and all identified as Black or African American, were dating, engaged, or married heterosexual relationships and in relationships for at least 6 months. They were recruited via social media and given a link to an online survey. In the survey, they answered questions that asked how frequently they experienced racism, how they saw their partner's support in the relationship or lack thereof it, and then they rated the quality of their overall relationship. So to give you some demographics of the people in my study, the majority of the people were female. These were individual responses, though we recruited couples that we were looking at in the analyses. Majority of the participants had been in a relationship for a year or longer and had attained a bachelor's degree or higher, and finally resided in the southern region of the United States. And so these were the findings. It was clear that participants, individuals who were experiencing a high frequency, often experiencing encounters of discrimination more than others, were also reporting less support from their partners, or reporting that their partner's support was negative. And because of that, they were rating less positive qualities about the relationship and more negative qualities. So in other words, participants were given a list of words, negative qualities such as feeling distant or cold, positive qualities of feeling close and connected. Participants were putting more negative qualities as reports for how they felt about the overall relationship because they felt they were getting less support from their partner or getting a negative type of support as they experienced many experiences, as they experienced many encounters with racial discrimination and racism on a daily basis. And so the thing about research and research studies is it only tells half of the story. So it was important to me to kind of sit with these results and in my own way understand what the process was between couples as they dealt with these experiences. So in other words, what was the process within the relationship they were going through to deal with and process through these experiences? That allowed me to come up with this cycle of re-injury and repair. And so for it to be a little helpful to explain this cycle, I'm going to give kind of a scenario of partner one and partner two hypothetically. So say partner one is on the job and they're having a rough day. Say they're the only minority at their workplace and they're experiencing subtle but racist remarks and comments and interactions with their colleagues, maybe even their supervisor. Say that they check their phone and they just saw yet another example or yet another experience of a Black person in America being murdered by the police, another injustice that has occurred. Say that they decide to run to the gym after work, so they throw on a hoodie and some sweats, but then they stop at the store before they get to the gym, and now the white store manager is staring them down, you know, looking at them suspiciously as they walk through the store. This is an example of daily occurrences, subtle or explicit, that partner one could be experiencing on any given day. I call these experiences rejections because now this person is questioning, do I look suspicious? Do I belong in this job? Am I capable? Am I qualified? Am I enough? And these really core questions that racist experiences can cause a Black person to ask themselves. And so because all of these experiences are piling on, and it's quite common for their experience every day, they may not even be aware that all of this is weighing on them, but they still have a reaction, right? Because all of these things are happening internally. So they go home to partner two, and they seem a little bit more short-tempered, a little more withdrawn, and their partner picks up on that. This is where we get to response. So their partner may pick up on their short-temperedness or these arguments that start coming up more and more, and they begin to withdraw from their partner who was experiencing racism outside of the relationship. And that can in fact be called a re-injury, because in a way the partner is left feeling even more rejected or even more withdrawn. But say the partner cracks a joke, tries to get their partner to laugh, maybe sits them down and asks them about their day and get them to talk about what's going on. That could be an example of a repair, in a way to kind of repair what the person is experiencing and opening them up to talk about it. And then say in that conversation, partners become aware that they've experienced similar things. And after they have this conversation, they're feeling more closely connected and together within the relationship. Those are two different pathways this cycle can take, and it's simultaneous and occurs over and over and over again. So I want to dig deeper into each of these terms. First, starting with racism. It's the belief that a person is superior or inferior based on the color of their skin. And so at its core, racism is placing one's own value above another because of their skin color. So if we're thinking about a very visceral example, the picture of a white officer kneeling on a Black man's neck is the physical and relational example of placing one's own life, one's own value above another's life and value. So this type of prejudice, this type of belief can become justification for acts of discrimination and eventually marginalization, which is more of a structural way that racism occurs, right? Now it's in our institutions, in our policies, and how we disadvantage these groups. So it can be subtle, it can be explicit, it can be unintended. Either way, they all have a profound interpersonal impact on a person. And so I want to dig deeper into why I call this a rejection. I saw in a research article that they describe racism and other types of marginalization as an interpersonal rejection. It leaves a person feeling inferior. It may cause them to experience shame or a depleted sense of self-worth, or even disconnection from self and others. Because again, we're talking about these negative and untrue messages that are being communicated within those interactions. And even though they may be untrue and the person knows they're untrue, they're left with two options: either to fight that and combat that on a daily basis, or to internalize and believe them. And so this impact is experienced within relationships, because nothing happens to us in a vacuum, right? When a bomb goes off, it affects the ones closest the most. So it could be a friend, a partner, or even your child, and how you're grappling with these experiences internally. So I call this a spillover effect, right? The reaction. Racism causes hypersensitivity, avoidance, withdrawal, anger and frustration, and these experiences often lead to trauma, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. At the root of a lot of these mental illnesses are experiences that we have been treated and felt rejected, where we are now questioning what our relational value is. So when I say relational value, that just means how we see our value in relationships with others within that context, because that is how we often see our value as individuals. And so I wanted to talk about what determines a partner's response in the moment, because if you think back to the cycle, it showed two different paths. Responses are tricky. So I say the goal of the response is mutual empathy. The reason why mutual empathy is important is because mutual empathy, the practice of that perspective taking, opens up the door for partners to identify what the common enemy is, which is not each other. So when working with couples of all races and backgrounds in therapy, I'm always saying it's not about the trash, right? It's not about this common superficial argument that me and my partner seem to keep having. It's about a need that needs to be met, a need that the partner might not be aware of themselves, and a need that the other person might not be aware of. And so some questions that could be helpful for partners are, am I aware of my own stressors in the current moment? And what am I attributing my partner's stress to? And so also what story do I tell myself about me and about my partner? So if partners are able to use mutual empathy to create a dialogue and to identify what this threat is and what the need is deep down, they may be more likely to take the path of repair. And so let's talk about those two intersections of repair and re-injury. So repair and re-injury depends on if a partner is able to respond correctly to their partner's reactions. And like we said earlier, that can become difficult if both partners are experiencing racism outside of the relationship and other rejecting experiences. A quote that I like to use that I heard a researcher talk about in terms of trauma is that trauma occurs in relationship, and we get hurt in relationship. And so the way we heal from trauma or we heal from harm is within relationship. So it all occurs within a relationship, whether it's directly with the person who caused it, or indirectly with the people around us. Some examples of unsupportive responses and supportive responses from the survey where my participants were answering questions were, for example, my partner blames me for not coping well enough with my stress. That is an example of how the person may experience a re-injury, right? So I'm already being blamed when I'm walking around the grocery store for something that I didn't do, but I look suspicious because of my skin color. But now I'm feeling a similar sense of blame within the relationship for whatever reason. Supportive response is I show empathy and understanding to my partner, or I give them the opportunity to communicate, and we try to cope together and search for solutions. So supportive responses sound like easy. Yes, that's what we need to practice in all relationships. But I'm really trying to stress is that these responses become even more important for Black couples and other marginalized couples in their relationship because of what they're experiencing outside of it. So the key, the antidote, the cure, if you will, that in terms of how I understand this process to go and what allows couples to more likely take the repair route rather than the re-injury route is the concept of relational equity. So relational equity is the practice or experience of fairness and justice in relationship with others. And the reason why I believe relational equity to be kind of the antithesis of racism and rejecting experiences is going back to what I said earlier about those experiences at their core being another person putting their value above another's, whether that's communicated through a look, a tone, an action, an experience. Relational equity is about the balance of fairness and justice. It's about treating a person as your equal. And this principle, as I said earlier, becomes even more important for couples with marginalized identities within their relationship because they're experiencing in their outside world reoccurring experiences of other groups, other people, placing their relational value over theirs and treating them as such. So to dig deeper into relational equity, I want to go back to the cycle that I showed earlier, which is on the repair side of things. So if relational equity is about the practice and the experience of fairness and justice, then I think the practice is repair, those repair attempts. And I think the experience is how couples feel when they are reconnected. And so these two things are really the basis for what relational equity looks like. And to paint that and illustrate that, with the balance, you see, rejection is an imbalance in terms of values and how we treat each other. Relational equity is more of a balance of fairness. And to illustrate this even further, I wanted to show the differences between these two side by side. So as you see, racial discrimination starts as a belief, an attitude, a value, and then it comes out into language, actions, and behaviors. So if we're trying to connect this with how what interactions look like between couples, then maybe a unjust type of interaction might look like feeling or acting superior to your partner, using contempt and criticism, shutting down your partner, blaming your partner, minimizing your partner, taking away their voice in some way. It's essentially interactions where that communicate these messages of you are of lesser value, even if it's not associated with race. It's just what these experiences cause us to feel like on a core level. Whereas relational equity is the way I see my partner is as my equal, and the way I treat my partner is as my equal. So that looks like sharing the responsibility, taking responsibility for mistakes within the relationship, creating a balanced dialogue of being able to express needs and wants and concerns, being able to both feel heard and seen and loved equally within the relationship. And so a lot of these things sound like stuff we already strive for within relationships. But I think what's new for us is to understand how these interactions become that much more important for marginalized couples, and how they can even exacerbate the experiences that of what happens outside of the relationship for individuals on that level. And so essentially repairing reconnects partners that have been disconnected as a result of experiences with racism. And mutual empathy is what opens the door for repair attempts, right? Attempts to repair what has been damaged. And reconnection is the experience of relational equity and the being able to practice that as a principle of relationships. But I have a mouthful to share on this slide, and it's that relational equity is a principle that we all should be practicing in our everyday lives, right? It's how we should be treating each other in relationships in general, and especially our romantic relationships with the person that we share life with. And I also want to add that this model of reconnection and disconnection, or disconnection and connection, apply to different couples. It's not just Black couples, it's other couples, it's LGBTQIA plus couples, couples with any other marginalized identity, and they experience this sort of minority stress outside of the relationship. They can also relate to these same principles within the relationship, and relational equity then becomes extremely important for them too. But I want to revisit the findings of my study that was couples were reporting less support as they experienced more discrimination, and also a negative quality of their relationship. A new thought for me after looking at it with new eyes is, well, maybe when at the time of the survey, the partners were reporting their partner support, maybe it wasn't that the partner's support was less or any different in those moments than it was on any other day. Maybe the need was different. So maybe there was more of an underlying need that needed to be met in those moments that partners were unaware of because of those experiences happening outside of the relationship. But I also want to say that we should be doing more than just teaching couples how to cope within relationships. And I know that was a lot of what my presentation is about, is teaching couples how to cope. And I think that's important. But even more important is the need for social justice in our world, right? The need for us to be treating each other equitably in our relationships and equally. And so going back to those needs that partners are having, I want to say that they're not responsible for healing that wound of racism, right? That is a specific wound that happened on the basis of race. And that's not exactly what's occurring in the relationship, but re-injury is occurring. So partners are responsible for the re-injury that occurs, because little do they know they're giving their partner the gift of being heard, being seen, feeling equal to another, feeling safe. Those are things that are robbed from us when we experience racism and racial discrimination outside of the relationship. So partners then are responsible for giving back those gifts, even more so for couples who are marginalized, right? But in terms of healing from racial wounds that are caused by racial discrimination, therapy is important. I'm always going to advocate for therapy, identity work. Research shows that the more one is strong in their racial identity, the more that is protective against those experiences, because it gives them a strong sense of who they are. Even though there's this constant fight that has to go on with these untrue messages that are being communicated in those experiences, there's this also protective factor and pride in who I am, right? There's also what could be important is surrounding yourself with community, a community of family and friends and people who are allies, and also people who identify with you in your experiences. These are, and the last one I want to add is social justice advocacy and activism are really powerful ways to begin to heal those specific wounds that couples at the end of the day aren't really, they're healing each other in some ways, but a more direct treatment of that would be some of those things. And so it's just so important for couples to be able to see that and be able to give each other the gift of being seen and heard and treated equal in a relationship. And that's where my idea of relational equity comes from. But I just want to reinforce that, you know, social justice is really the cure for it all, right? Because if we were all practicing equity in our relationships, Black couples wouldn't have to fight to be resilient and have to fight to cope within their relationships or cope in other ways. And so I want to make sure I drive that point home, because a lot of the research likes to say, well, wow, we want to romanticize resiliency, that these marginalized groups can overcome the odds and they can rise above. They shouldn't have to. They just shouldn't have to, right? Place. And so we want to be careful about just saying couples have to cope and they have to learn how to cope with those experiences. So thank you so much today for attending my presentation. I'll leave it open to questions. I'll share my last slide, that if you have any questions after the presentation from me, here's my email. Feel free to reach out to me. Also, if you want to keep up with some work that I'm doing in relation to these issues, you can give me a follow on Instagram at The Social Justice Therapist.
Thank you so much, Melinda. That was an incredible presentation. You spoke so eloquently. We do have one question already in the chat, and instead of trying to summarize it, I think I'm just going to go ahead and read it off. And if there are other questions, please throw them in the chat. We have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions at this point, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and hear what questions you have for Melinda. So first, thank you for coming. Your presentation was very insightful. I loved your emphasis on a resilience approach instead of a deficit perspective. My question is about the role of reading out loud is not one of my strong suits, is intersectionality on your sample. I believe you stated a majority of your sample was female. If so, what role do you think being a member of 2 oppressed groups had on your participants? In what ways could this impact the couple's perspective, taking in empathy? And again, thank you so much for your time and willingness to share your research.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you to who raised that question. That's such a good question, and something I should have touched on too, but intersectionality definitely plays a role. So for anybody who's not familiar with that term, intersectionality just means that a person has multiple marginalized identities, right? I'm a Black person, but I'm also a female. And so I can experience discrimination based on my skin color and based on my gender and so on. So I think intersectionality so much plays a role and I hope in future research I can really take into account. But if partners are being able to, say it's a heterosexual couple, and they're able to relate to each other's experiences in terms of race, they may not be able to completely understand at times the differing experiences of being a female as opposed to a male, and the discrimination that comes based on gender, and how that can create an extra level of stress, an extra layer of stress for one partner. And so I think that's definitely how it plays a role, because intersectionality creates a unique experience then for partners within the relationship, and the amount of stress that they're under, and how they need to support each other through that.
Thank you for that. We've got another one. Do you think you will do another similar study which targets responses from the northern region of the US to assess how responses may differ based on geography?
Yes, that's one limitation of this study, is that it just so happened majority of the participants were from the South, because it can vary people's experiences based on region. So that will definitely be a goal of my dissertation level research as I go further in my PhD. Hopefully I will have the resources to make sure I'm like recruiting from different places or trying to reach participants of different areas. So then I could really generalize, if that makes sense, my conclusions, because I can only really say this was the experience of a lot of couples within the South. I can't say that was the experience of couples across, states or regions. So that's definitely something I'm looking to take into account and address in the next study to make it stronger and be able to generalize those assumptions.
This is a question coming from me. If you had all the time and the money in the world to redesign this study, what would it look like?
Oh, wow. That's like a student's dream, right? To have unlimited resources for their study. I would even say one thing I definitely want to do is, if we're talking about how these results can apply to more than just Black couples, I want to open it up to couples of different sexual orientations, different national origins, couples that can be experiencing other levels of discrimination. That probably, has to be accounted for in my analyses, and maybe coming up with something a little more complicated and understanding how all of that works together. But if I had unlimited time and resources, I think either way, I'm going to open it up to more than just Black couples, because I really think that even though different groups experience discrimination differently, it really comes down to these same core things in terms of relational equity and how we experience it on a human level. So that's one big thing I would change.
Well, thank you so much, Melinda, for being here tonight and for giving us your time. And audience, you all have been fantastic. Audience, please look for a feedback survey to come out here in the next few weeks. And also, we've got 3 more presentations coming up, so we hope that we will see you at one of these in the near future. But thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of the evening.
Thank you, everybody.